There are orders written in field manuals, and there are laws of war that every soldier swears to uphold. But what happens when a soldier encounters something that no law can describe? On May 5, 1945, the men of the U.S. 11th Armored Division entered the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. What they saw there made battle-hardened men weep like children. And what they did, just hours later, to the SS guards, remains one of the most carefully hidden and darkest chapters in the history of the American Army. Official reports would later be rewritten. Witnesses would remain silent for decades. But today, we reconstruct the chain of events that led to an act of vengeance unlike any other. May 1945 in Austria was unusually beautiful. Spring was in full bloom, bright green hills, flowering apple trees, and a clear blue sky. For the tankers of the 11th Thunderbolt Division, these were the final miles of the war. They already knew Berlin had fallen. They could taste victory, and they dreamed of only one thing: getting home to Ohio or Texas, alive. But as they approached the small town of Mauthausen, the air began to change. At first, it was just a faint, sickly sweet smell carried by the breeze from the direction of the granite cliffs. Soldiers who had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes knew the smell of death, but this was different. It was concentrated, ancient, and infinitely heavy. Suddenly, the lead Sherman scout team stopped. Out of the thick roadside brush, something stepped onto the road. The soldiers didn't realize at first that it was a human being. It was a creature weighing barely 70 pounds, skin stretched over bone, every joint visible. It wore a striped rag that had once been clothing. The creature didn't beg for food. It just stood there, staring at the tanks with eyes that held nothing but an endless hollow void. This was the first survivor of Mauthausen, and at that moment, the Americans didn't know that an entire army of these ghosts was waiting for them. Nor did they know that the men who had reduced them to this state were still inside the stone walls of the fortress, hoping for the mercy of the Geneva Convention. Mauthausen was not like other camps. It was a true fortress of gray granite, towering over the Danube. The Germans called it the Knochenmühle, the bone grinder. It was the only Category 3 camp, the harshest in the SS system, a place from which there was no return. When Sergeant Albert Kosiek's tanks crashed through the forged iron gates, the world of the American soldiers split in two. First, there was silence, a dead, crushing silence. And then, from the barracks, they began to emerge. Thousands of living skeletons. They moved slowly like a film in slow motion. Some tried to smile, but instead of a smile, it was a ghastly grin of skin stretched over teeth. Others dropped dead right in front of the tank treads, unable to survive the shock of their long-awaited rescue. The Americans jumped from their vehicles, desperate to help. They handed out their rations, chocolate, crackers, and then something happened that changed their psyche forever. The prisoners, barely tasting the rich American food, began to die in agony. Their starved stomachs simply couldn't process it. The soldiers watched as the people they had just saved went into convulsions at their feet. Rage began to boil in the Americans' veins. It was a quiet, icy rage. One private, John Miller, later recalled, "In that minute we stopped being soldiers. We became witnesses to the end of the world, and we started looking for the men who had done this." Every time they found another hiding SS man, the pressure grew. The prisoners, seeing their tormentors, went into a frenzy. They threw themselves at them with bare hands, trying to bite and tear. The American guards tried to push them back at first, but after seeing the death block, where people were starved and frozen for experiments, they simply started looking away. What exactly happened when the Americans gathered the first large group of captured SS at the camp wall?
Why is there a strange multi-hour gap in the division's official logs for that day? And how did ordinary boys from small-town America in a single evening turn into executioners? When the sun began to dip toward the horizon on May 5, 1945, Castle Mauthausen was no longer just a concentration camp. It had become purgatory. The American soldiers of the 11th Armored Division, men whose mothers and wives were waiting for them at home, transformed in a matter of hours. They became men whose souls had been burned to ash. They walked through the camp, and every meter of ground revealed new abysses. In the barracks, they found living people, too weak to even raise a hand in greeting. In Block 20, the so-called Block of Death, they saw walls scarred by the desperate attempts of humans to survive conditions that no animal could endure. But the most terrifying part was still to come. While some units handed out water and medicine, others received an order: comb the SS barracks and the surrounding woods. The command knew that hundreds of guards couldn't just vanish. And it was in these moments that the secret history of vengeance began to unfold, a history that official chronicles would choose to ignore. The SS men from the Death's Head units made a fatal mistake. They thought that by shedding their black uniforms and putting on civilian coats, they would become invisible. But they forgot one thing. Thousands of people knew their faces. Thousands of those who just yesterday trembled at the sound of their boots.
American patrols were combing the woods when the pointers began to emerge from the ranks of the survivors. Former prisoners, swaying from hunger, followed the tanks, simply pointing a finger at men hiding in bushes or basements. When the first guard was dragged into the light, he began to scream about the Geneva Convention, claiming he was just following orders. Private Michael Kovac, an American tanker, later wrote home, "We looked at this man. He was clean, well-fed, he smelled of good soap, and behind him stood skeletons who hadn't eaten in months. In that moment, I felt something inside me just break. We didn't want to take prisoners anymore." The unspoken agreement of that day was simple. The officers looked away. When the next group of SS was found, the U.S. soldiers were in no hurry to reach for handcuffs. They did something far more terrifying. What happened at the famous quarry was long considered a camp legend until the witnesses spoke. A group of several dozen captured SS guards was led to the top of the stairs of death, those same 186 steps where they had driven men to their ends for years. The American soldiers stood in a semicircle, blocking the exits, and then they stepped aside, letting the prisoners forward. The very same people who, that morning, couldn't even stand on their own feet. Seeing their tormentors without weapons, the prisoners were transformed. A rage that had been coiled for years finally snapped. The Americans didn't interfere. They stood with rifles over their shoulders and smoked, looking the other way while hundreds of emaciated people tore their executioners apart with their bare hands. This wasn't a battle, it was a spontaneous execution. The SS men, who once saw themselves as supermen, begged the Americans for a bullet, for a quick death, but the Americans were ice cold. One sergeant simply said, "A bullet costs too much to waste on you. Finish them yourself." In that moment, the law officially ceased to exist in Mauthausen. The hour of great retribution had begun. The darkest part of this story took place deep within the camp structures. Americans discovered a group of SS officers barricaded in an administrative building. When they were flushed out, the soldiers found documents and photographs of experiments, reports on how long a human could live in freezing water and how quickly death comes when gasoline is injected into the veins. An American lieutenant, seeing this, ordered the SS men into the courtyard. Later, the report would state that the prisoners resisted during an escape attempt. In reality, they were simply put against the wall. No trial, no priest.
A burst from a Browning machine gun ended their careers as masters of the world. But even that wasn't all. The most shocking act occurred when the Americans found the head overseer of a subcamp. Prisoners told them this man loved setting his German shepherds on the weak. The Americans found his kennel. They locked the overseer in a cage with his own dogs, who hadn't been fed in days. The soldiers stood in silence, listening to the screams, while the animals, failing to recognize their master, carried out justice. Why do we hear so little of this in the history books? The answer is simple. What the Americans did in Mauthausen was technically a war crime. Executing prisoners, even monsters like the SS, violated every international norm. When the High Command and the Red Cross arrived a few days later, the courtyard had been swept clean. The bodies of the SS had been hauled away, buried in mass pits alongside their victims. It was officially announced that the guards had fled or died in clashes with rebellious prisoners.
The American command chose to close its eyes. They understood that no military tribunal could convict a soldier who had just seen mountains of corpses in a crematorium. But the soldiers' psyches were shattered. Many of the men of the 11th Division never led a normal life again. They returned home as heroes, but in their dreams, they remained forever within the granite walls of Mauthausen. Today, Mauthausen is a memorial, quiet, peaceful, sun-drenched. But if you walk those 186 steps, you will feel a cold that doesn't go away, even on the hottest day. This story is not about cruelty. It is about the fact that human patience has a limit. The American soldiers came to Mauthausen as liberators and left as judges. They broke the laws of men to fulfill the law of supreme justice. We will never know the exact number of SS guards who met their end that day. Those numbers were erased from the archives, but they are burned into the memory of the survivors. It was the only day in the war when good decided to use the methods of evil to ensure that evil was finally destroyed. Never forget, when civilization meets absolute barbarism, sometimes the only way to remain human is to become a punisher for just one day. But that day leaves scars that never truly heal.